Varghese.
Thank you so much, Nath. And kia ora, my comrades. Before I start, I would like to teach you something I learned from Cuba. It is one of the first sentences I learned in Spanish when I arrived in Havana in December 2025. And it goes like this, because it was on purpose, right? I asked people, this is the first sentence I want to learn. How do you say death to the empire in And this lovely man who I met in Cuba taught me. The slogan is like this: Abajo el imperialismo. And then you will respond with abajo. Can you say it?
Abajo.
Abajo el imperialismo.
Abajo.
That's it. So let's begin. So here we go. Cuba and our collective struggle against imperialism. We must locate Cuba's struggle not as an isolated struggle, but as part of the global struggle against imperialism. And that's what my talk is going to focus on today. And before I start, I want to quote, unfortunately, our finance minister, Nicola Willis, who just yesterday said that, reassured New Zealand people saying, don't worry, there are fluctuations and problems and disruptions happening in the global oil market. However, there are 13 tankers coming en route to New Zealand at the moment, and this will give us 52 days worth of buffer. Now, this is interesting because suddenly everyone is waking up to the reality of an oil embargo. Now, this has been the reality for Cuba for the last 3 months. Not a single oil tanker, not 13, not a single oil tanker has arrived in Cuba in the last 3 months. And just thinking about Ian's talk there and about how he mentioned the focus on well-being, that there, to me, is the success of a worker-organized state. When the working class holds power, then workers' rights, come to the top. And here we are at the Ōtautahi Trade Union Center, and we must remember that Cuba is a successful example of workers' rights coming into power. And this is exactly the impression I got when I was there. I was impressed with the achievements of a state that is organized not by the bourgeoisie, but by the workers. Okay? So we are currently living through the age, I'm going to term it, the age of hyper-imperialism. And I'm not alone in terming it hyper-imperialism. Many people say this is the case. Some people say that, the United States is in decline, and this is the final, fireworks before it dies off. We hope that it dies off. But the time that I was going to Cuba, this is, there was a before, a during, and an after of hyper-imperialism. So, I get this golden opportunity to present a paper at the University of Havana. And, I considered it the pinnacle of my career to this day, to be presenting at an anti-imperialist conference in Havana, of all places, to meet some of the revolutionaries and the people who fought apartheid, for example, in the southern part of Africa. Also to learn about this worker-organized state called Cuba. So let me talk about before my trip, during, and after, just to take stock of the times that we are currently living in. Before I went to Cuba, Trump was threatening Venezuela day by day. In November, Trump closed the airspace of Venezuela. This is an act of imperialism. How can a guy sitting in Washington say to another sovereign country that their airspace is closed? This is not acceptable. But, the war drums were beating at the time. There were increasing attacks on common people, fisher folk off the coast of Venezuela and Colombia, normal fisher folk going on fishing trips, being killed like hunting game for no reason. This is like a sport. The lives of people in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Asia, don't mean anything to the empire. It's less than the worth of pets of the bourgeoisie in the imperial core. Our lives are less worth than that. And before my trip to Cuba was also the age of the live stream genocide, which we all watched through. You know, the whole-scale slaughter of people in schools, in hospitals, point-blank sniping of children, 8 points which became massacre points, right? So the imperial crisis is at its peak at the moment. Now, during my time in Cuba, that's when they kidnapped Maduro. Not only Maduro did they kidnapped his wife, who in her own right has a history of left-wing activism and politics. She's a lawyer and a strategist for the Chavez revolution, the Bolivarian revolution over there. And she and Maduro, whom, you know, contrary to the Western media narrative, is the legitimate leader of Venezuela. The legitimate sovereign leader of Venezuela is sitting in a prison in New York. Is this an acceptable situation? And nobody mentioned a thing. New Zealand didn't mention a thing. None of the imperial core nations mentioned a thing. Cuba was different, obviously. Cuba made statements. Cuba had big protest movements as well, opposing this. Now, we will talk about that. So during my time there, they basically invaded, conducted an effective kind of power change in Venezuela, and over 100 people died, right? Trump said it was completely clean, nothing happened. No. Over 100 people died, 32 of them were Cuban, okay? And people ask, why were Cubans in Venezuela? Cuba has a long history of thwarting assassination attempts, right? So Cuban military is specialized in this. How many assassination attempts were there against Fidel Castro? Can anyone guess?
Dozens.
Dozens? Yeah, according to one source, it was above 600.
Ooh.
According to others, it's somewhere around 100, okay? So there were definitely a lot of attempts, and Cuban military was, able to overcome those threats, and therefore they supported their sister revolutionary state of Venezuela. Now, after I left, I leave Cuba, taking so many lessons from this successful worker organized state. But I leave Cuba with a bleeding heart because the embargo is ongoing. It still hasn't received a single drop of oil. All the countries that provided oil to Cuba have been punished or threatened by the imperial hegemon. And this is why I have left Cuba with a bleeding heart, but with a mission, a renewed mission, which is my life mission, is to destroy the US empire. Now, after I left, we have new crises. Now, there's a war against Iran, right? And are these crises interrelated? Absolutely. Cuba sees it as an interrelated, the same struggle against imperialism. In fact, Fidel visited Tehran in 2002, and he said to the students of the Tehran University, who were thronging in a huge crowd, 700 of them, many of them couldn't enter the auditorium because it was full. And he said, the Shah of imperialism will fall too. You dethroned the puppet Shah regime, and he said, we together will dethrone the Shah that is imperialism. Now, let's remember what Che Guevara said. He said this, while envisaging the destruction of imperialism, which is what we all envisage, it is necessary to identify its head. Its head is none other than the United States of America. And this continues to guide our praxis against imperialism. Now, during my time there were two speeches. And afterwards, you probably recognize these speeches, do you? Yeah, so the first one is who? Mark Carney. He became a darling of the liberals across the world because of the speech. But ultimately, the message I took away from this speech is similar to the message that this guy gave, a Gusano. So, his name is Marco Rubio. And he said that, we stand, whatever happens, America is a child of Europe, and we stand basically for Western supremacy, is basically what he said. The thing is, both of these speeches, the first one was saying that we need to move away from US imperialism in some ways, like it was a very centrist kind of position, but both of them got standing ovations from audiences in Europe. Ultimately, they're not saying different things. The message that Mark Carney said, which I have taken from his speech, is this: we want to be at the table with the imperial core. He said this: if we are not at the table, we are on the menu. Do you remember? And that's all he wanted to avoid. He wants, he's fine with imperialism as long as they are at the table with those who are committing imperialism, and he is against Canada becoming at the receiving end of imperialism. So, this is also very funny. Trump sometimes does such good work in exposing the ugliness of the empire. And he released this private message from Emmanuel Macron. And it goes like this: my friend, we are totally in line on Syria. We can do great things with Iran. I do not understand what you are doing on Greenland. Let us try to build great things. So he's like, you can do whatever you want in Asia, Africa, Latin America, but don't touch our colonies, European colonies. Greenland is a colony, right, of Denmark. Don't touch there. I don't know if you remember the scene from The Godfather second part. It was New Year's Eve, and it's in Havana, 1958. This is the eve of the revolution, right? And if you watch this movie, you'll see that Batista and the gangsters, like this is Godfather, right? The gangsters from the United States, Havana was the play pod of them. It was rife with, organized crime, mafia, sex work, human trafficking. This is what Havana was. It was a puppet of the US empire, and it was a gang pad, extremely unsafe and extremely exploitative. And you see in this movie, as the midnight strikes, Batista and the gangsters are escaping Havana in small planes. And the day after this is January 1st, Victory Day, the victory of the revolution. On the 8th of January, Fidel Castro arrives with the procession of the victorious revolution into Havana. So I planned my trip so that I could be there during Victory Day, okay? Now, being in Cuba during the age of hyper-imperialism was quite interesting because it actually, there was so much anti-imperialism everywhere, right? People all know anti-imperialist chants like abajo el imperialismo, abajo, okay? And these are some examples of what I was able to do when I was in Cuba. This is a Palestinian student from Gaza. He was on full scholarship studying medicine in Havana. And he was one of the keynote speakers at the conference that I participated in. And he spoke about the connected or the same struggle or the one struggle that the people in Gaza and Palestine were going through and connecting it back to Cuba. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But this is from the largest anti-imperialist march I've ever been to in my whole life. And behind me is Miguel Díaz-Canel, comrade, the current leader of Cuba, the leader of the assembly, and he was one of the closest people to Fidel Castro. And the thing is, the march, we marched through the Malecón, which is the beautiful waterfront in Havana. And we walked past this ugly building, which houses the US Embassy. And people were, they were using expletives. They were showing the middle finger. And then beyond that, we walked towards this place where all the Cuban leadership was right there. And guess what? I actually got to speak with them. I said, "Soy comunista de la India." I said, "I am a communist from India." And they were all so welcoming, and they gestured and they smiled in very positive ways. I got to speak with the leader of Cuba. This is huge. These are the people at the front lines. They're risking their lives fighting imperialism on behalf of the whole world. So I hold them with great respect. Now, this is a cool uncle, comrade Jorge, who I met at the Fidel Castro Center. Both his parents were revolutionaries. They marched into Havana alongside Fidel Castro. He was only 4 years old at the time of the revolution. And currently, he's one of the staff members who teaches people who come to the Fidel Center about the history of Cuba. Also looking at how, Cuba has a very cosmopolitan international kind of culture. This is a young man I met in Havana. We were just having food. And we came across him. And obviously, when South Asians see each other in a very different place, we kind of say, "Hey, what are you doing here?" So he's from Sri Lanka. He arrived in Cuba 10 years prior on a full scholarship studying health sciences. He did a bachelor's, master's, and PhD, and he works with the Cuban volleyball team at the moment. And he's married there in Havana with children. Now, another thing I noticed was racial justice. The approach to racial justice and economic justice that Cuba has. So in New Zealand, for example, we have a very, we talk about diversity, inclusion, stuff like that. But generally, it's like, the CEOs and executives of arms companies, how many women are there? How many Black people are in the executive board of one of those companies? Arms companies. But that's not the model of racial justice in Cuba. The racial justice model is actually land back in practice. We say land back over here. Fidel actually did that. Fidel and his comrades, they did land back. The very homes that were built by the enslaved Afro-Cuban population, now those families are living there. That is a model of racial justice, that we can want to emulate. Now, this gentleman is Comandante Victor Dreke. He was second in command to Che Guevara in his mission to Congo. And he was also one of the keynotes at the conference. And in the post-revolutionary period, he was quite instrumental in the racial justice policies. But he also leads the committee on preserving the revolution. I also want to talk about, the public spirit, safety, despite scarcity. There's a lot of scarcity in Cuba at the moment, material scarcity. When I talk about Cuba, people say to me, you went to Cuba. Cuba's like, time stands still, right? And I was like, maybe on a superficial material level, that's the case. But when it comes to the social and communitarian values, it's far ahead in the future. You know what I mean? So on New Year's Eve, I was wondering, where will I go for a party? And I stepped out of my accommodation, and the party was on the street. The grandmas are there, the babies are there, the children, we're all just dancing together. I remember at 2 a.m., I saw this old grandma walking through the street by herself, and I was concerned, is she okay? Does she have a place to go? And she was totally fine. Cuba is one of the safest countries. Still, despite this intensified genocidal embargo, that redistribution of material wealth has created, social cohesion, safety, and, reduced crime. This moment in history that we live in demands that we rethink the dominant understandings of the world. We need to develop a sound understanding of the operation of imperialism. My presentation at the University of Havana looked at Che Guevara's approach to imperialism as reflected in his message to the Tricontinental. And I looked at what lessons we can learn from that message for today's context. Like more contemporary scholars in imperialism, Che too approached imperialism not merely as a tendency of big countries, right? That's how a lot of people in the West understand imperialism, as like every big country or every country that has power is an imperialist country. Che didn't subscribe to that view. Che looked at imperialism as a world system. Sorry.
You stood on it.
Yeah.
No,
COVID.
on the wall, you stood on it.
Oh, no. Okay. Che looked at imperialism as a world system. And when you look at more contemporary scholars, they look at imperialism also not as just an ism or a tendency, and there are multiple imperialisms. No, we need to identify the top power and how the global financial system works, how the knowledge systems work, how the global military network works, right? And so when you have that, a materialist approach, a historical materialist approach, we can say that indeed the United States is the imperial hegemon. Che also critiqued the dominant Western approach to peace, which is the lack of war, because he was interested in looking at structural violence. And he understood that even after the end of the World War II, there was so much violence against the Third World, and this doesn't indicate that there was peace. And he also talks about the Korean War, in which like 10 to 20% of the population of DPRK was killed. And, Pyongyang was flattened like Gaza. So he looks at that and he critiques the notions that peace existed after World War II. Now, this is from my presentation at the university. And these were the interpreters who live translated my speech to Spanish. Now, this young woman, she's a lecturer at the University of Havana in the Interpretation Studies department. And this young woman was her student. And it was really interesting how they set the whole thing up for the conference. Now, what is the status of the world today? It's been 81 years since the end of the World War, but it's instability, poverty, super exploitation. Therefore, there's a continued relevance for anti-imperialist thought that the Tricontinental Conference in 1966 upheld. Now, I just want to quickly talk about the global imperial system. So just making it into your minds that imperialism is not just a tendency or an ism, it's actually a system, a global system, which is, a network of connected institutions through which, this is the important thing. If you can take one thing away from today, this is what I want you to take away. Imperialism is the instrument or the set of processes which enforces capitalism globally. So imperialism is not just capitalism. It is a system of processes and infrastructure through which capitalism And capitalist exploitation is imposed across the world and enforced across the world, right? So from that perspective, it is the United States and its allies that are imperialist in nature. If you look at China, for example, they're not imposing capitalism. In fact, they are friends of non-capitalist states like North Korea and Cuba and so forth. They're not trying to impose capitalism on other sovereign nations. And why is the Cuban model so important, and why has Cuba become a target of the empire? How am I for time?
Over.
You're good?
Yeah.
Okay. Cuba is a threat to the empire. According to this young man, who is from Gaza, in his speech, he said, in Cuba, when you come to study medicine, you don't just become a medical professional. Cuba trains you to be a revolutionary, like Che Guevara. And he said to me, I rose up after his presentation. Most people were moved to tears because there was also a documentary called From Gaza to Cuba. I highly recommend this documentary. It's available on YouTube. And I said, it was really powerful because it shows the connected nature of our struggles. And he said, yes, Gaza is being flattened because Gaza is in a geopolitically significant region and the empire cannot allow sovereignty there, right? Any sovereign movements in the Middle East threaten access to resources, access to trade routes, and so forth. And therefore, Gaza's, Palestinian sovereign movement is not acceptable. Iran's sovereignty is not acceptable. He said, Cuba, on the other hand, it doesn't have so many resources. It's not in a huge resource-rich island. But he said, what Cuba represents is an idea with which we can defeat imperialism. The threat of a good example, right? They want to make sure that that good example is destroyed. Now, as Ian said, Cuba performs better than the United States on key human development indicators, not just life expectancy, but also education, health, maternal mortality, crime. Crime is so low. Housing, right? So I arrived in Cuba after spending 7 days in Vancouver, Canada, and I was shocked by the level of homelessness in Vancouver, one of the rich cities in settler colonial Canada. Is people just increasingly homeless during the peak of winter. And some of them are collapsing. And then the whole city just moves on as if it's normal. The fentanyl crisis from the United States has crossed the borders and arrived in Canada. And then I arrived in Cuba and I couldn't see that level of homelessness anywhere. I looked for it and I inquired. Apparently, there's some homelessness now, but it's negligible. It's not really visible in the way that it is in Western cities. So this is the model that is a threat to capitalism, right? The continued existence of capitalism and capitalist imperialism. So before the revolution, like I said, it was a hub for international organized crime, high levels of corruption. After 1959, the state drastically reduced violent crime and so forth, right? And here is an example of a successful program. And the other day I was listening to our comrades from the Philippines, and they had gone to the rural parts of the Philippines and asked the people, what do you want? And the people said, we want education. And Cuba achieved that, right? Cuba eradicated literacy within the span of 8 months or 1 year. So in September 26, 1960, during his first speech before the United Nations, Fidel made a commitment of eliminating illiteracy. He said, Cuba will be the first country in America within a few months that can say it does not have a single illiterate person. And they did. Other examples of transformation of Cuba, you can look at it. Inequality, healthcare, life expectancy, infant mortality, all these things. housing, and so forth. The Cuban embargo, like Ian said, is an economic warfare. And when I was there, I wasn't able to access my card or my bank account. I called up ANZ and I said, what's going on? New Zealand doesn't sanction or embargo Cuba, so why can't I use my New Zealand card here? They said that they are following the US laws. Because every transaction, MasterCard, Visa, it goes through New York, the headquarters. And they have been fined in the past for allowing it, so they don't. And they said that this is also part of our ethical policy against terrorism or something. And I said, which other countries apply? And they said, North Korea, Iran. And so you see, these are the target states, and Russia, I think they mentioned. We look at these countries as other imperialisms. I say that they are the target states of the empire. Now, there are two additional unresolved problems. This is from Duarte Diaz in 2018. He says, it's not only the economic warfare, but there's also ideological and information warfare going on. There's illegal radio and television broadcasts from the United States against Cuba, which kind of shows Cuban government in a bad light, trying to turn the people against their government. There's also programs aimed at destabilizing and subverting the Cuban constitutional order. So the United States is not only doing an economic warfare, but it's also doing an information warfare. So if you studied Marx's theory of base and superstructure, the United States is actually attacking Cuba on both dimensions. The Cuban model of internationalism is so remarkable, right? They laid over 3,000 lives in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. And European and Western countries were like, why are they going to Angola? Maybe they want their diamonds. Maybe they want their minerals. The idea of internationalism based on solidarity and the common goal of destroying empire is just not, it doesn't enter the heads of the capitalist empire. They provided material support to the Palestinian resistance, military training, and also support for the PLO in the 1970s. Che Guevara visited Gaza in 1959, soon after the revolution. 1959 was the revolution. He visited Gaza in 1959. Also education, scholarships, right? And providing medical missions. They provided medical missions to Africa during Ebola crisis, to Italy during COVID crisis. They offered medical missions to the United States during Katrina, and the United States rejected it. It would have helped many people there, right? But recently I've been hearing a lot of growing concerns. This is my last bit, okay? Maybe 5 more minutes or so. When I talk to my activist friends, my comrades from around the world, they have the sense of creeping pessimism, right? So, for example, Trump is now, he's losing in Iran, right? And this is a very, egotistical maniac. Cuba is much more smaller and easier, probably, for the United States to destroy or attack or something. So increasingly, my comrades around the world are saying, there's just a sense of pessimism. What is going to happen to Cuba? And this was also part of my bleeding heart, I told you earlier. It was also my worry about what's going to happen to this revolution, which proved that putting the needs of people above the needs of profit is actually successful, despite, economic warfare and so forth. But this is the reason why I have hope. And this is what I'm going to show you before I end. What is the Cuban state? What is the model? Western liberals like Zohran Mamdani, he called Cuba a dictatorship. So does everyone in the Democrats and the Republicans. They all call Cuba a dictatorship. But to the contrary, Cuba has a workers' state. It's a workers' state with a participatory democracy. It's not the same democracy as we have here, but I'll give you some features of it. We don't have much time. One of the key features of it is the Cuban Communist Party, right? PCC, Partido Comunista de Cuba. And 1/6 of the Cuban population are members in this party. And becoming a member is not an easy thing. It's a thing of honor. You have to prove your worth. And you got to get nominated by fellow workers. So your comrades have to nominate you to become a member, and then you're a member candidate for a year. And then if you prove yourself, then you can become a member of the Communist Party. Number one. Number two is the Cuban state operates through mass organizations. The first one is the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. There's also the Cuban Women's Federation, the trade unions. So the trade unions are integrated into the structure of the state. The Association of Small Farmers. Almost all adults in Cuba belong to one or more of these organizations. And these organizations are actively participating in the policy making of the Cuban state. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. There's also the organs of popular power. There's provincial and national governments. There are locally elected delegates who don't even need to be part of the Communist Party. They have a right to recall them. There's a National Assembly and provincial assemblies. So the West tries to say that any model that's not the Western model of multi-party bourgeois politics, they say every other model is a dictatorship. But actually, the Cuban model might be more democratic, right? Because it's not only participatory in its decision-making, it also assures that people have a stake in the economic base of their nation, a democratic economy as well. The common struggle between Cuba and Iran, I talked about this. I just want to finish my presentation with this statement from Che Guevara. Our every action is a battle cry against imperialism and a battle hymn for the people's unity against the great enemy of humankind, the United States of America. Patria o muerte, which means homeland or death. And then people respond with venceremos. Can you do that? Venceremos. Patria o muerte.
Venceremos.
Venceremos means we will overcome. Okay? Thank you so much.